A king lost his head in a public square while thousands cheered. That image is what most people remember about the French Revolution, a story of starving peasants rising up against a decadent monarchy. But the real chain of events that led to that guillotine started somewhere almost nobody expects, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in a war France wasn't even fighting for itself. In 1778, King Louis XVI made a decision that felt, at the time, like a triumph. France agreed to support the American colonies in their war for independence against Britain, France's oldest and most bitter rival. French ships, French soldiers, and French money poured into a conflict thousands of miles from Versailles. And when the Treaty of Paris finally ended the war in 1783, Britain had lost its American colonies, and France had won a satisfying strategic victory. But that victory came at a staggering price. Historians estimate France spent over 1 billion livres supporting the American war effort, at a time when the French crown was already deeply in debt from decades of earlier conflicts, most notably the 7 Years' War. This is a detail almost never taught in classrooms. One of the direct financial triggers of the French Revolution was France's own involvement in helping create the United States of America. By the mid-1780s, the French monarchy was spending more than half of its entire annual budget just paying interest on accumulated debt. This wasn't a temporary cash flow problem that could be solved with a good harvest or a new tax. It was structural, and it collided head-on with an even older problem that had existed for centuries, a tax system built on privilege rather than fairness. Under the French monarchy, the population was legally divided into 3 estates. The clergy, the first estate, and the nobility, the second estate, were largely exempt from France's major taxes. That left the third estate, everyone else, peasants, urban laborers, merchants, and the growing professional middle class, carrying almost the entire tax burden of a nation drowning in war debt. And here is the number that puts the injustice into perspective. The Third Estate made up roughly 97% of France's population, yet bore the overwhelming majority of the fiscal weight required to keep the monarchy solvent. Louis XVI's finance ministers tried repeatedly to fix this. Turgot, then Necker, then Coligny, each proposed reforms that would have taxed the nobility and clergy more fairly. Each time the privileged estates blocked the reforms through the regional parliaments, courts controlled largely by the nobility, who had no intention of giving up their exemptions. By 1786, the Treasury was effectively bankrupt, unable to secure new loans at reasonable rates, and unable to raise sufficient revenue through the existing unfair system. Louis XVI, cornered and out of options, made a decision no French king had made in 175 years. He summoned the Estates General, a representative body of all 3 estates, to convene at Versailles in May 1789. This wasn't an act of enlightened democratic reform. It was an act of desperation. A king with no other tools left to fix a treasury he had inherited, and then made worse. The meeting immediately exposed exactly how broken the system had become. Under the traditional voting rules, each estate cast a single collective vote, meaning the clergy and nobility, representing perhaps 3% of the population combined, could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1, regardless of how many actual people the Third Estate represented. Frustrated by this structural rigging, delegates from the Third Estate, joined by sympathetic clergy, and nobles, broke away in June 1789 and declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the French people. When royal officials locked them out of their usual meeting hall days later, the delegates gathered instead on a nearby tennis court and swore an oath, now known as the Tennis Court Oath, not to disband until France had a written constitution. This was, in essence, the first true act of the Revolution, weeks before anyone stormed a prison, and it wasn't a mob action. It was a calculated political revolt by elected representatives against a rigged voting system. Then came July 14th, 1789, and the event that would become the Revolution's most famous symbol, the storming of the Bastille. The popular image is dramatic, a fortress prison overwhelmed by thousands of Parisians demanding liberty. But here's a detail modern historians point to that rarely makes it into the popular telling. When the crowd finally broke into the Bastille, they found only 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 men held for mental illness, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned at his own family's request. The Bastille wasn't stormed because it held political prisoners in dramatic numbers. It was stormed because it held something the revolutionaries desperately needed: gunpowder and weapons, at a moment when Paris feared the king was about to send troops to crush the new National Assembly by force. The symbolic power of the event, a hated symbol of royal authority falling to ordinary citizens, mattered more than what was actually found inside, and it permanently changed the character of the revolution from a political dispute among elites into a popular uprising with the capital city itself in open revolt. Word of the Bastille's fall spread through the countryside within days, and it triggered something almost never discussed outside specialized historical study, a wave of rural panic historians called the Grand Père, the Great Fear. Rumors spread through French villages that noble landlords were hiring gangs of brigands to destroy crops and punish peasants for the unrest in Paris. Terrified rural communities armed themselves, and in the chaos, panic curdled into action. Peasants across the country began attacking chateaux, burning feudal records and land ownership documents that had bound them to centuries of obligations and dues owed to noble landlords. This wasn't organized by Parisian revolutionaries at all. It was a spontaneous, decentralized collapse of the feudal order itself, driven by fear and pent-up resentment, and it forced the hand of the National Assembly. On the night of August 4th, 1789, overwhelmed by reports of rural chaos, the Assembly formally abolished feudal privileges altogether, a stunning reversal that dismantled centuries of noble and clerical privilege in a single legislative session. For the next several years, France attempted something genuinely unprecedented, transforming an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one, while simultaneously fighting off invasion from neighboring monarchies terrified that revolutionary ideas might spread across their own borders. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by the fate of the French royal family, declared their intent to restore Louis XVI's full authority by force if necessary. This is a crucial piece of context modern historians emphasize heavily, and one the popular narrative often strips away entirely. What followed, the radical phase of the Revolution, cannot be fully understood without recognizing that revolutionary France was a nation genuinely at war, invaded on multiple fronts, its new government convinced, not entirely without reason, that internal traitors and foreign monarchist conspiracies threatened to destroy everything the revolution had achieved. It was in this atmosphere of genuine external threat and internal paranoia that the period known as the Terror began in 1793, led by the Committee of Public Safety and its most infamous member, Maximilien Robespierre. Historians estimate between 16,000 and 40,000 people were executed during this period, some by formal trial and guillotine, others in mass killings during suppressions of counter-revolutionary uprisings in regions like the Vendée. Robespierre justified the violence as revolutionary necessity, famously arguing that terror without virtue was destructive, but virtue without terror was powerless, a chilling formula for governing through fear in the name of protecting the revolution itself. What most people don't fully grasp is how quickly and completely the terror consumed its own architects. Political rivals were denounced and executed with dizzying speed. Georges Danton, once one of the revolution's most powerful voices, was guillotined in April 1794 after falling out of favor. And then, in July 1794, in an event historians consider one of the revolution's most dramatic ironies, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed by former allies who had grown to fear they would be his next target. The man who built the machinery of the terror died beneath its blade within months of Danton in an event now known as the Thermidorian Reaction, named for the revolutionary calendar month in which it occurred. The years that followed the terror were marked by exhaustion, political instability, and a government, the Directory, that struggled constantly to maintain control amid economic hardship and continued warfare. France had spent a decade in near constant upheaval, cycling through constitutions, governments, and waves of violence, and by 1799 much of the population and much of the political and military establishment had grown desperate for stability at almost any cost. It was into this exhaustion that a young, wildly successful general named Napoleon Bonaparte stepped, seizing power in a coup in November 1799 and eventually declaring himself emperor 5 years later. Napoleon's rise is often treated in popular history as the point where the revolution effectively ended, but many modern historians argue it should be understood differently, not as an ending imposed from outside, but as the revolution's own logical, almost inevitable conclusion. A nation so thoroughly exhausted by a decade of instability that it willingly traded revolutionary ideals for the promise of order under a single powerful leader. So what does the popular version of the French Revolution get wrong? It isn't that the popular version is false, exactly. Louis XVI truly was executed. The monarchy truly did fall. Ordinary people truly did rise up against centuries of inequality. But the popular version compresses an intricate, decade-long chain of cause and effect into a single satisfying morality tale. Greedy king, starving peasants, justice served. The reality historians study is a chain of unintended consequences, each solution creating the next crisis. A war fought to weaken Britain nearly bankrupted France. A desperate attempt to fix that bankruptcy exposed a rigged political system built on privilege. Exposing that system triggered a popular uprising nobody could fully control. That uprising triggered foreign invasion. That invasion justified a terror that consumed the very revolutionaries who created it. And that terror left a nation so exhausted it accepted an emperor in exchange for peace, ending, ironically, with France once again ruled by one man wielding near absolute power. Only 16 years after that power had first been overthrown. There is a pattern historians return to again and again when studying revolutions across history, not just in France, but in Russia, in China, and elsewhere. Revolutions rarely follow the clean script their early idealists imagine. They tend to move through cycles of genuine liberation, followed by chaos, followed by fear, and often followed, eventually, by a return to centralized, authoritarian power, sometimes stronger than what came before. The French Revolution gave the world extraordinary and enduring ideas: liberty, equality, fraternity, the modern concept of citizenship, human rights enshrined in written law. But it also demonstrated in vivid and often brutal detail how fragile those ideals can be once the machinery built to defend a revolution turns inward on itself, hunting for enemies among its own architects. Perhaps that is the truest lesson buried beneath the guillotine and the storming of an almost empty prison. Revolutions are not single events with clean beginnings and endings. They are chains of unintended consequences set in motion by people trying to solve one problem, only to discover, often too late, that their solution has quietly created the next one.